to business, and I welcome our second panel of witnesses. John, is it Deighan? Deighan. Sorry, my apologies. The Parliamentary Officer, Catholic Church's Parliamentary Office. Clemmons, Scottish Church's Parliamentary Officer representing the Church of Scotland, Professor Tom Devine, Senior Research Professor in History, University of Edinburgh. Welcome you all to the committee, and I go straight to questions from members, please. John? Oh, James, sorry. James. Too many Johns. James.
Name, Convener. Thank you, Convener. One of the issues that has run through the debate around this bill is, what actually is offensive behaviour and what is offensive behaviour in terms of a football match. Last week, we heard different views, particularly in terms of, the songs that are sung at football matches. And we heard some of the football representatives saying that, it's not really offensive, it's all part of the football experience. We heard others saying quite specifically that it was unacceptable to sing anti-papal songs, and others also saying that in a football match context it was unacceptable to sing chants or songs in support of the IRA. How do the panel feel about that debate, and do they feel the legislation is helpful in terms of tackling some of the issues that have arisen?
Now, panel members just indicate they want the microphone will come on, and so who would like to address that first, please? Mr. Deighan.
Well, I think in terms of the exact songs and exact chants, I mean, the Catholic Church wouldn't claim to be expert in that. We realise that the government authorities or state authorities have a legitimate task to perform in ensuring that they have public events like football matches conducted in an orderly way. So there is a question of balancing the different principles, which we can only offer sort of guidance on what those principles are, but we believe there should be a wide latitude to freedom of expression, that must be upheld, and that any intervention should be ones which are necessary. And we believe that the football clubs have themselves identified particular chants, particular songs, and they have tried to eradicate that and just change the culture to try and take the heat out of it and the stuff that is likely to stir up the trouble and the hatred.
Anyone else wish to comment? Professor Devine.
Yeah, I find it difficult to respond to that question because I can't certainly define what is offensive. Offensiveness is in the eye of the beholder. Let me give you an exemplar of what I'm talking about. I may be one of the few people in this room who have actually attended a sectarian aggravated case, breach of the peace, at Persheriff Court last March, when I was asked to give so-called expert evidence in the trial of two individuals who were accused not only of breach, but of sectarian aggravated breach. And this was based, of course, on the existing law, Section 74 of 2003 Criminal Justice Act. The sheriff, in my view, because it was a summary proceeding, there was no jury, the sheriff, in my view, performed sensibly and effectively. And to be specific, he began by saying, unlike the Assistant Procurator Fiscal, a song like The Fields of Athenry, well-known song at these matches, is an Irish folk song, and therefore should not be considered seriously in this trial. He then went on to consider the issue of whether references to the Irish Republican Army, whether it be the old IRA, so-called, or PIRA, the Provisional Republican Army, in the streets of Perth in the early morning, amounted to a sectarian aggravated breach in terms of the 2003 amendment to the Criminal Justice Act legislation. And he decided that since this organisation was primarily not based on religious hatred against another group, the case was unproven. And he found the two individuals guilty of breach, but not of sectarian aggravated breach. And this crystallises, in my view, Convener, a very important point. The difficulty that's going to be faced by law enforcement officers, by sheriffs and by juries, in my view, is definition of the term offensive behaviour. This whole issue developed out of what is sometimes referred to as sectarian hatred. And I can define that for you if you wish. But in my view, the original legislation of 2003, in relation to some of the issues that confront you, is perfectly adequate. The only two inadequacies in it are lack of enforcement by police officers at certain football matches in the past, when people literally get away with brazen murder in terms of what they are allowed to sing. And secondly, the very important new clause, I think, is certainly something which could be rationally argued and accepted, namely the reference to unacceptable communications. And it's interesting that, although I haven't read that, that second piece of proposed legislation in detail, the sense I have from it is the focus there is very much on religious hatred, not the blanket term offensive behaviour.
I think that's not the correct stuff of particular description.
Okay.
Do you want to go
Can
on?
I just follow up with Mr. Deighan? You spoke about your support for freedom of expression. In terms of the way the bill has been formatted, do you feel there's a danger there that it could undermine freedom of expression? Have you got concerns in that regard?
I think the lack of a freedom of expression clause is what has been alerted to us and shared amongst many groups, Christian groups in particular, that there could be free discussion, frank discussion, which for some people can be offensive, which may be caught by this legislation. I think that would be the trouble. To tackle that, I think it would be looking at something they've done, perhaps the way they've done it in England, looking at ensuring explicitly that people are allowed to freely express their views, especially in terms of religion or belief, so that they know they have that safeguard, rather than having to rely on what is deemed to be reasonable, which I think can change radically, especially in different environments and who you may be speaking before. So I think that's the suggestion that we would have to make sure that a recognised human right protected, the European Convention of Human Rights in particular, if we look at the way those rights are qualified, Articles 9 and 10 in particular, if we look at how they're qualified there, that's the sort of qualifications we should be looking at in this bill to make sure that the rights that we should have as citizens are protected to a maximum, really, and not curtailed.
How would you categorise freedom of expression in the context of a football match?
Well, again, football matches are not a specific expertise of the church. We wouldn't claim that they were, but it's like any expression in any public event. If I could just be allowed to compare it to that, because again, the church, in terms of our social teaching, we would be looking at the principles that lie behind particular pieces of legislation, rather than the technical details of that. If the government thinks that there is a problem in a particular context, i.e. in football matches like this, it has a right to take action which is necessary to maintain public order. So I think that principle is certainly arguable. The government, certainly in discussing with the Catholic Church, has made a good case that it thinks is a problem. It cited the examples of last season where there was trouble in football matches. So they have a duty to act, they have a right to act, but that right has to be balanced up with the rights of individuals in society. And we would just say that the omission in the bill that makes sure that balance can be achieved properly is lacking if there is not a freedom of expression clause explicitly in there. We think reasonableness isn't quite sufficient, especially when that can be subjective.
What would you give as an example of somebody's right to freedom of expression at a football match which might be compromised by this legislation?
Well, it's not just at football matches, it's extensively. So, for example, you might have cases which have arisen are like preachers who may be standing in the street who may decide that they want to go to a football match. They may want to give out religious tracts, and someone at that football match may say, well, we find that offensive, we find that is stirring up hatred. That's the sort of thing that could be caught if there weren't an explicit protection for people in that situation. I certainly don't think there's people would be chanting doctrinal chants in a football stadium. I've certainly not come across that. But I think it's the wider environment. That the bill is very wide in who it can encompass. I heard some of the evidence earlier about it's actually in locations outside of the football match. It could be people travelling on the same train as football supporters, sitting in the same pub or club as football supporters, and we have to look at making sure that their freedoms are protected as well. So
your freedom of expression concerns are more beyond the football match than in the football stadium itself?
We're pleased that, to try and offer what help we can as the Catholic Church, but and we believe that the issue has drawn us in to some extent because there is a recognition that there's some anti-Catholic element is part of sectarianism, and we're happy to contribute what we can in that where we can help, but we're certainly not claiming to be experts of how to run orderly football matches.
Could you perhaps expand on freedom of expression pertaining also to the second part of the bill, threatening communications, which Professor Devine referred to, where there are two different kinds of offences, I understand it. One is a violent act, incitement to violent act against a person of a particular description, so it's not relating particularly just to religious matters. And separately, there's an or condition B, so they're not together, that the material is threatening and the person communicating it tends to, by doing so, to stir up religious hatred. How does freedom of expression on the internet? I mean, we don't want to just look at this. Remember, there's another other part to the bill, so I'd quite like you to talk about that as well in this context.
Yeah. Want me to answer that?
Please, yes, if you wish.
Sure, yes. Well, I mean, we've stated clearly, threats of violence are unacceptable. We're all in favour of stamping out on that. Again, the other condition that you mentioned could catch broader communications, and one of the examples that's been raised and brought to our attention is religious debate, for example, that could occur where people see it as an open criticism, and the Catholic Church is subject to open criticism as well, where that is seen as stirring up hatred against the Church. Similarly, debates between Christians, Muslims could point to fears that Christians have about Sharia law or particular elements of the Quran. Things like that where people are frankly and maybe not tactfully, although we would argue, of course, people should try to be tactful, but there are situations where they may not express themselves as well as they might, and it can be caught, it may be caught by the bill. So I think there would be an argument to make sure that that sort of frank, open, robust debate around religious beliefs should be allowed to take place in society without fear of being prosecuted under quite a heavy penalty for it.
I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, particularly about the internet, before I go on. I've got a supplementary in this column. Is it on freedom of expression? And
yes, it would be.
Sorry, you were about to answer, Ms Clemmons, and then I'll take Colin in. Yes.
I think I would agree with John that the bill has two completely separate pieces of functionality, and that we had a very similar conversation in the Church of Scotland about the fact that within a football match, we thought that actually these provisions could be really useful. And there was a lot of support for the idea of saying that normally people wouldn't behave in that manner. There's a lot of people go to football matches and behave in a way, in that context, they wouldn't have in the rest of their professional lives. I thought there was a big advantage to naming that offence and pushing that quite hard and saying, we expect you to exercise some self-control here. But we also thought that in terms of freedom of speech, in the second half, in the threatening communications section of the bill, there were some real issues with how wide that drafting was. But we would see those two quite separate issues.
Colin?
Thank you, Convener. On the freedom of speech element, you mentioned the European human rights legislation